all started with a card, black with a white logo that entranced. This card seemed to hold my future while I held it in my hands. As I held the card with my shaky hands and sweaty palms, I knew that in a few moments my life could change forever. It was last summer, the summer before my senior year, when my life changed forever. I had been to a CIY conference called Move. It was later on in the week. I had already done a lot of things that needed to be done, such as forgiving people that I needed to forgive and confessing sins that had been holding me back. I felt like a new person, but there was still one thing that I needed to do. For about 6 years now, I've wanted to do missions. It's something I love doing and strive for. I remember being 12 years old and going to Acuna, Mexico with my family for the first time I ever went on a mission trip. There, I met kids at an orphanage and fell in love with the people and the language. Even though at the time I was only 12 and didn't know much about Spanish, I only knew basic words like hola and adios. I never really felt a language barrier between myself and the kids. And in that moment, my 12-year-old self realized that there was no language barrier between two people that loved Jesus. And because of that, I learned that I wanted to be a missionary. I continued with this dream of mine all through middle school and high school, but it was always a roller coaster of emotions. I would have spurts where I would just feel so happy about doing missions and really feel like that was what God was calling me to do. But then I would just drop and feel completely apathetic about the whole thing. And I didn't feel good enough to do missions. It was always back and forth on if this was really what God was wanting me to do or not. And more often than not, I really felt like this wasn't what God was calling me to do. So that's where I stood at the Move conference, thinking that there was no point in pursuing a career in missions. I felt like God wanted me somewhere else, but I didn't know where that was. I felt completely lost. I'd felt that way for a while, and when I got to Move, it was no different. My best friend, who was also planning on pursuing missions, would come up to me all week and tell me about how excited she was that we would get to both pursue this career and tell other people about God in these foreign countries. She confided these feelings in me because she thought I felt the same way, but at the time, it couldn't be further from the truth. So when Move began to end and the ceremonial endings were happening, I felt completely lost. But just as I was beginning to wonder where I would go from there and what career I would pursue now, the Kingdom Worker cards were passed out. These cards were given out at the end of the week. Each student could take one as long as they promised to do whatever the card said to do. As I held my card in my hand, I realized what I needed to do. I lowered my head and prayed to God as everyone around me sang one last song with the band. I asked God if He would take the situation from me, if He would show me what He wanted for my future. I didn't want to hold my future in my hands anymore. I wanted God to, and I should have wanted that from the beginning. I asked God that if missions was what He really wanted me to do, if He would show me on my card, by putting something to do with missions on there. I knew it was a long shot, not even really worth asking. But it was the only choice I had, and I was so lost. So as I walked to my youth group's meeting spot with everyone else, I held my card in my hand. Eventually I sat down. 5, 10, 15 minutes passed until what felt like an eternity. Eventually, I was told I could open my card. With shaky hands, I flipped the card over and tore the paper binding. I immediately burst into tears. The card said this: "Find a missionary your church supports. Ask them how you can help them." The Lord had answered my prayer in that moment, and I knew that missions truly was what God wanted me to do. So that's my story. It's how I fell in love with missions, which eventually brought me closer to God than I would have ever imagined. I'm still learning to love like Jesus does, and I'm so excited to learn more about Him as I pursue a degree in intercultural studies at Ozark Christian College. I'm happy to know that God holds my future, and I'm excited to love others in faraway lands. So that's how I was called to missions and preaching to others internationally. I'm so thankful for the story God has given me.